So welcome everyone to this symposium titled Biodiversity from Knowledge to Policy. I am thrilled to see so many of you were able to come here this afternoon, and kudos to your excellent immune systems as well in this flu season. For those following the streaming, warm welcome to you as well. My name is Ingunn Store. I work for the Norwegian Environment Agency, and I also work for the Secretariat in IPBES. We have an exciting program here today, where leading speakers will share their insights on challenges and opportunities for developing knowledge and formulating policies for the sustainable governance of biodiversity. But first, a couple of housekeeping items. Norunn Sæther Myklebust sends her apologies for not being able to attend, but her colleague John Linnell will be presenting instead. And to be able to find time for all our excellent speakers and have a break, we will end at 5:30 today. This symposium is organized by NTNU Sustainability and the Norwegian Environment Agency, and we will hear from the heads of both NTNU and the agency. So first up, please join me in a round of applause for the rector of NTNU, Gunnar Bovim.
Thank you, and it's good to see you. Here's the co-hosts in the Norwegian Environment Agency, Friends of Knowledge-Based Public Debate. Really, Friends of Knowledge-Based Public Debate. Dear everyone, I think this is going to be a great day. It's difficult to say so walking through the snow weather, but I heard that in Copenhagen you long for snow, so yes. NTNU is dedicated to the task of overcoming the grand societal challenges of our time. So much so, actually, that our new strategy actually includes the 17 Sustainability Development Goals, specifically every one of them. Our contribution toward solutions for these goals will be a key indicator for measuring how our university evaluates our own achievements. So our vision, which we've had for some years, but we've renewed it now, is knowledge for a better world. And we like to say, and we think that this is something we do. It's not just a slogan. And therefore it's important for us to discuss how do we organize our efforts. We have defined sustainability as a key strategic thematic area for the whole university. Not only one department for sustainability, but it's for the whole university. This facilitates a multidisciplinary effort which is able to draw academic resources from all our 8 faculties. Helge Brattebø and Anders Strømman have been given the task to spearheading our common effort, which we named NTNU Sustainability. I know that you and your team has an aim to be an international leader, and that you really encourage quality. Research on sustainable development of society includes environmental, economic, and social aspects in the broadest sense. So we trust you. So far, so good. We've found an approach that will play on NTNU's strengths and ambitions. However, we also know that cooperation across borders with best minds in academia powers the top-level research and innovation and teaching that these tasks requires. Just 1 hour ago, I met with the Norwegian opposition leader, Jonas Gahr Støre, and he talked about that we have a too long distance between politicians and researchers. And especially, we have a too long distance between politicians and the technological researchers. And we need to shorten that distance. because the democracy is dependent on that politics is based on facts, is based on values, and is discussed openly. Therefore, I'm confident that this will be a great day. And we're, of course, especially happy that you, Sir Watson, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to Trondheim. I must say it's a typical Trondheim weather, but we never say so. I think you've done a massive effort to put, from the 1980s, many of the very important global questions onto the political agenda. We need that. We need more people like you, and we will try to learn from you today and discuss with you, because we also think that coming here will develop you. Every day, good discussions will develop everybody taking part. So, looking forward to a great day. I also want to welcome my co-organizer, Ellen Hambro from the Norwegian Environment Agency. You've got a cold, you said?
Yes.
Yes. But we'll listen carefully.
Thank you.
Thank you. We are very happy to be co-hosting this seminar on the link between knowledge and policy making, together with NTNU and their research area, NTNU Sustainability. And I would like to second Dr. Hoven's word and wish you all a very warm welcome to this seminar, and especially to our excellent speakers.
There will be too much.
Just a few more words. 700 employees in 2 offices in Trondheim and Oslo, and we also have hundreds of local officers in the Nature Inspectorate around the country. We work with a whole range of environmental issues with climate, biodiversity, pollution, and outdoor life. And we have 5 functions in all these areas. We monitor and map the state of the environment. That's a priority area for us, simply because knowledge is the foundation for all our work. And broad and relevant, scientifically sound knowledge is the basis from national and international providers, is the basis for what we do. And also we systemize and communicate lots of information to the general public through different channels. We administer laws and regulations and subsidy schemes, and we also do control and inspections to ensure that laws and regulations are followed up. We supervise and guide the regional level, and we have another function going upwards towards the ministry. We give advice on the development of new environmental policy. We propose measures, instruments, we make analyses, proposals for new regulations and so on as a basis for the ministry development of new policy. And we also coordinate a lot of work towards other agencies in other sectors. And we participate on a broad scale on the international level, international agreements and conventions, and also platforms such as IPPC and IPBES. The Norwegian government's policy is designed to play an important part in achieving international and national targets for biodiversity, including the Aichi targets under the Convention on Biological Diversity. Norway launched a biodiversity action plan in 2016, Nature for Life. It was presented for the Parliament, and it's a direct follow-up of the Aichi target 17. Norway's action plan for biodiversity states clearly that knowledge-based management is the main pillar for everything we're going to do related to biodiversity management. Knowledge generation is of a major importance for us in the agency. The agency, we are not working with research ourselves. but we monitor a lot, as I said, and we point out the need for new relevant research, and we make use of a lot of research in our work. And all this knowledge that we gather and that we process and that we manage is an important basis for how we deal with biodiversity and with the development of the national policy in this area. We also identify, yes, that's, yeah, I mixed my slides. We also identify priority research areas, illustrated by this publication here. We point out what are the needs for new research in the coming period, and our ministry just recently presented a knowledge strategy where they underline the very importance and the increasing need of new environmental knowledge. Environmental problems affect all sectors in the society and must be resolved in a cooperation between different sectors and with a range of different instruments. The various sectors has a joint responsibility to achieve climate and environmental targets, and our agency cooperates extensively with lots of other sector authorities. And then again, having quality knowledge bases is crucial for the management of environment across the sectors. Just to illustrate how important this is for us, I will give you a few examples. Norway manages the only remaining population of wild European reindeer, and we have a special international responsibility in this regard. In 2016, a reindeer in Nordfjella population was diagnosed with chronic wasting disease. It's a very deadly and very contagious disease that affects deer, moose, reindeer, and related species. The Norwegian Food Safety Authority, together with our agency, asked the Norwegian Scientific Committee for Food Safety and Environment to assess issues related to this disease, questions related to food safety, to transmission between animal, to wildlife management, and so on. And assessment from the committee stated very clearly that the culling, which is a nice word for killing, of all the reindeers in Nordfjella was necessary to have a chance to get rid of this very serious disease in Norway. And the government decisions follow up the advice from the scientific committee. It's a very sad but unfortunately necessary action, and our staff is now in the mountain doing the culling of this reindeer. Another example, the white paper that I just mentioned on biodiversity aimed to develop more specific protection goals for each ecosystem with concrete measurable indicators for good ecological status. Scientifically based indicators is considered is to be developed by scientists. And the scientists are to determine threshold values necessary for a set of indicators. A scientific committee expert group from different fields presented their recommendation for such a system to us this summer, and we presented our recommendation to the ministry this autumn, and the ministry is now working together with other ministries how to make this system works. And they are supposed to decide which part of ecosystems, how big areas, and where in the country should the ecosystems achieve good ecological status. And this framework for good ecological status in all the ecosystem is supposed to be in place by 2020. Just another last example of how we work with scientific knowledge as a basis for what we do is from the area where we work to combat hazardous substances. Brominated flame retardant is a substance that's used for many purposes, in electronics, in installations, in cars and other purposes. And Norway, among other countries, we're very concerned about the toxic effect and ability for long-range transportation of this substance. It has been found in animals in the Arctic, far away from the original source. And Norway was a driving force in order to ban the use of brominated flame retardants in EU and also on the global arena under the Stockholm Convention. And the scientific monitoring results from Norway was the solid scientific documentation that made those bans go through on the international level. I have hundreds of other examples just to illustrate that solid scientific knowledge base, we are totally dependent on it to move further on environmental policy. IPBES and IPCC, and Bob, you've been chairing both of those very important bodies. They are two unique scientific sisters on the global arena. They are both established to provide very policy relevant, but not policy prescriptive, and very solid scientific knowledge for the whole global society as a basis for policy makers and a basis for managers. The quality work of top scientists across the world and the analysis and knowledge provided by these sisters are both, in a way, myth busters and eye openers. And they are important agenda-setting bodies. Our agency is focal point for both IPBES and IPCC, and as such, we are part of the delegations for the plenary meetings. We coordinate Norwegian the reports from IPBES and IPCC to the general public in Norway. We are also hosting the IPBES Technical Support Unit for Capacity Building, where Ingunn is heading that unit, and Norway has supported capacity building ever since the beginning establishment of IPBES, and we also participate in the bureau by Mr. Ivar Baste. Before I end my presentation, I just wish to express my gratitude to the work of Norwegian and other knowledge institutions which have shown a clear commitment to ensure the success of IPBES and IPCC. They have nominated authors and experts and reviewers, knowing that they will need to commit a considerable amount of work and effort. I know it's hard work to participate in this, but I also know that it's quite inspiring to meet and discuss and cooperate with scientists from all over the world. Lastly, I want just to mention that we think it's very important that IPBES and IPCC cooperate good together on questions that are related both to climate and biodiversity, and there are quite a few of those. For instance, questions related to forests and ocean. And I would also like to underline the importance of strategic partnership between IPBES and global knowledge institutions, such as the Global Environmental Information Facility, represented here today by the Executive Secretary, Donald Hubben. Anton Chekhov, he once said that knowledge is of no value unless you put it into practice. And that's what we're trying to do all the time, to be the link between knowledge and final policy making by the ministry. Thank you, and I wish you luck with this very interesting seminar.
Thank you so much, Ellen, for that introduction. So, our next speaker is an inspiring human being and comes with a long and impressive CV. Professor Bob Watson has done quite a bit after he received his PhD in chemistry from London University in 1973. So he has worked as a chief scientist at DEFRA. He's been a chief scientific advisor and director for environmentally and socially sustainable development at the World Bank. Associate Director for Environment in the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the Executive Office of the President in the White House, so that was under Al Gore there, and Director of the Science Division and Chief Scientist of the Office of Mission to Planet Earth at the National, or at NASA, basically. So in parallel to his formal positions, he has chaired, co-chaired, and directed a number of national and international scientific, technical, and economic assessments on stratospheric ozone depletion, biodiversity and ecosystems, climate change, and agricultural science and technology, including being chair, as Ellen just mentioned, of IPPC and now currently the chair of IPBES. He has also received numerous national and international awards and prizes for his contributions to science, including recently the Champions of the Earth Award for Science and Innovation by the UN Environment. He has also been recognized by the Rolling Stone magazine as one of the 25 movers and shakers for the environment. Today, he is the Director of Strategic Development at the Tyndall Center for Climate Change Research, and as I mentioned, the chair of IPBES. Please put your hands together for Sir Bob Watson. The floor is yours.
First, let me say it's a real pleasure to be back in Norway. I've been here many times before. You play a crucial role in the scientific debate, and Norway always plays a crucial role in the political debate on environmental issues. And as you just heard, is a major player in both IPBES and IPCC. And as an aside, of all the awards I've got, my daughter was most impressed with the Rolling Stone acknowledgement. The rest she doesn't care about. Okay, what I'd like to do today is talk about these following 5 topics. What are the challenges of developing cross-sectorial policies and coalitions? Absolutely crucial. No one scientific discipline, no single government agency can address the issues of climate change, loss of biodiversity, and development. Secondly, I'd like to talk about the role of national and international scientific assessments. Third, then I'll talk a little bit about where are we on climate change, where are we on biodiversity, and what are the links between climate change, loss of biodiversity, and the 17 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So first, what are the challenges? And I see there's about 12 different challenges to actually deal in a cross-sectoral manner. The first one is to get different government departments to recognise that both human-induced climate change and loss of biodiversity are critical not only to their department, not only to their constituents, but also the private sector and to civil society. It cuts across departments of energy, environment, water, finance, etc. No one government department, but rarely a government structure set up nationally or internationally to deal with a cross-sectoral issue. The second issue is related to that, and the governments have to recognise they have absolutely stovepipe sectoral departments, and they're rarely addressed or structured in a way to look at these cross-sectoral issues, but they have to. The third question is, how do we understand not only climate change in its own right, how do we understand biodiversity and biodiversity loss in its own right, but what's the relationship to them to what the average person in the street cares about, and that are the development goals: food, water, energy, human health, security. The fourth one is, have we all got the same vision of the future? What do we want the world to look like in 2050? And I'm sure if we asked everyone in this room, you'd come up with 50 to 100 different answers. What does a developed country like Norway or the United States want that vision to be? Totally different from the vision that if you're living in Ethiopia today or you're living in Mali, where they don't even know, the average person, where the food is going to be tomorrow morning, what the healthcare system looks like, or whether they're going to have clean water. So it's absolutely crucial as we think forward, what is the vision we want? How do we define sustainable development? We then have to say, look, one's got to take a long-term view. Thinking about the next political cycle of the next round of elections or the next quarterly report of the private sector is not the way to deal with any of these issues. We need to take a long-term perspective of 50 or 100 years, but if not that, at least 10 to 20 to 30 years. Most politicians tend to think about the next electoral cycle. Most people in industry think about the profit margin for the next quarter. The next challenge we have to recognise is basically, what is the evidence base? We all have to agree on what is the evidence base upon which to have policies in government, policies in the private sector, the role of the NGOs, basically. So this is where national and international assessments are absolutely vital. And I would argue that while IPCC is wonderful, IPBES, of course, now arrangerer, is even more wonderful. Crucially important is to do national assessments to complement the international assessment. What do we know? What don't we know? What's the level of certainty or uncertainty? Seventh challenge, very straightforward. You have to have all actors working together. It's not an issue just for government or the private sector or the NGOs or the important role of media in communication. And we therefore need all of the actors to both co-design and co-produce both knowledge and the assessments. And so it's really crucial that we work together to make sure that we're doing academically sound work, but also is of societal relevance and will provide the information that governments, the private sector need to have informed policy, basically. We clearly need to understand quantitatively the indirect affect the indirect drivers, economic growth, demographic change, socio-political change. How do they affect the direct drivers of climate change? How do they affect the indirect? If you don't understand the drivers, you can't set policy. It's really about as simple as that. We then basically move on to is to develop, how do we develop participatory processes? And in reality, when you actually look at this, we actually have a very dysfunctional system. Governments aren't well set up, as I already said. You've got sectoral stovepipes. At the international level, it's exactly the same. The UN system is very stovepiped. The conventions are stovepiped, but so are universities. And the challenge of a university is how do you work across different intellectual departments? Also, what are the funders? Certainly in the UK and the US. They're also sectoral. In the UK, there's 7 big research funders. There's one for social science, one for natural science, one for engineering, one for health. The only way we can deal with it is to look at how do you fund multi and inter and transdisciplinary science. And then the journals are set up to be very, very disciplinary. So one's got a challenge in the academic community of the structure of universities, the structure of the funding agencies, the structure of journals. The governments that make decisions have also got these stovepipes. And in all cases, the challenge is how to work together and how to reduce the gap, as you rightly said, between policy and the academic community. And that's where this idea of co-design and co-production is really important. It's crucial we as an academic community understand politicians, understand policy. Equally important for politicians and policymakers to understand the academic community. Absolutely vital, basically. The 10th challenge is we have to recognise policies and technology absolutely crucial to attack climate change, absolutely crucial for the loss of biodiversity, but without behaviour change from the individual to communities, to governments and to the private sector, we cannot succeed. So the issue of behaviour is absolutely crucial, to say the least. The 11th, basically, and it's a really interesting one, every minister, when they're asked to serve, is to make their government department successful. Trouble is to deal with these issues we're talking about, as we said right at the very beginning of my first challenges, they've got to work together, and we therefore have to recognise there are wonderful synergies of win-win across government departments, but there's also trade-offs, and we have to understand that rarely will a government decision to protect biodiversity, climate change and development be the absolute optimum for energy alone or agriculture alone or water alone. There are trade-offs that we have to understand in order to develop the optimum policy for a sustainable world. And the last one is, and this is where, to be quite candid, the scientific community is hopeless mainly. They've got no clue about the complexity of the socio-political system, no clue about political reality, no clue about the power of the vested interest. As we know, politics is the art of the possible, and all politics is local, but we're trying to solve a global, long-term issue. And until we understand political realities, how decisions are made, we will not be successful as an academic community, to be quite honest. So many academics feel, if I tell them this, it's obvious what the policy should be. Unfortunately, it's not. So the other point is totally trivial. All of these issues are interconnected. You can't think about climate change without thinking about stratospheric ozone depletion, biodiversity, forest, water, desertification, air quality. Climate change affects all of them, and they in turn all affect climate change. So it's one big interacting system, which by definition is not just an environmental issue, it's a development issue. And so there are the policy frameworks incredible. There's hundreds and thousands of policies and agreements. I will focus actually probably only on two, climate change and biodiversity. But the big global ones are stratospheric ozone depletion, climate change, biodiversity, Convention on Biodiversity with its Aichi targets, and land degradation, the UN Convention to Combat Desertification. Also, recently, incredibly important, three big global agreements. The Paris Climate Agreement to limit climate change to no more than 2 degrees Celsius with a goal of 1.5 degrees Celsius. No chance of making either of them in my opinion, but we should strive for it. The 20 biodiversity Aichi targets, which I'll later show we're going in the right direction, but nowhere near enough. And then the 17 UN Development Goals. And all of those three are totally intertwined. You can't deal with the Paris Agreement without thinking about biodiversity. You can't deal with the 17 UN Sustainable Goals without dealing with both of those. These are all development issues. These are not the first two, simply environmental issues. Okay, so what's the role? Well, is clearly scientists should provide unbiased evidence, and politicians should make policy based on, informed by the scientific evidence, basically. A decision maker, doesn't matter where they are, whether it's government, private sector, civil society, they need a consensus view, not your paper or yours. They really need a consensus view of what do we think is known and unknown. What are the uncertainties? They need a comprehensive look. Therefore, by definition, we need comprehensive transdisciplinary research programs. We don't want the social scientists here and the humanities here, the engineers here, the lawyers here, the natural scientists here. We've got to recognize that to address these problems, while you do need deep specialism, you also need to work together across disciplinary boundaries. There's no question. It means the research programs have to be academically strong, and the assessments have to be policy relevant, but so does the research. And therefore you need well-defined rules, principles and procedures in order that everyone buys in to the scientific results and the assessment results. The research programs, I've really already said that. You have to involve scholars from all fields. It needs to be heavily peer-reviewed. And to be honest, these international assessments are so much better peer-reviewed than any paper in Nature or Science or any international journal. Most papers are only peer-reviewed by 2 experts. When we do an international assessment, such as IPCC or IPBES, hundreds of experts review pages. Most governments in the world do. It's incredibly heavily peer-reviewed. As I've already said, we have to think about co-design and co-production. They have to, if they're international issues, be geographically inclusive, and they have to be evidence-based, not ideologically based. I chaired one assessment on agriculture, unbelievably difficult subject, genetic modification. Absolutely ideological views were put forward. Organic agriculture, can it feed the world? The role of pesticides, the role of international trade, unbelievably political issues. And one has to make sure you can cut out the political issue and say, what is the hard evidence base, basically, for these issues? As I've already said, we have to understand the links between environmental issues and development issues. We have to engage literally everybody. We have to understand the political, socio-political. And what we have to do is assessments need to describe the consequences of both inaction, if we don't act, but more and more what governments want to know about and the private sector is, can we act? What's the option space? What's the role of technology? What's the role of policy? Where does funding come in? What's the importance of behaviour change? And we actually need to show there are multiple benefits often of action, and the cost of action is far cheaper than the cost of inaction, especially if you look over a reasonable time frame, basically. And so of all these international assessments, They've all got a very similar structure, highly technical chapters. The IPCC, I think, has lost its way a little bit. That last time there were 4 volumes, each 1,000 pages. 4,000 pages is way too long, but they all have a summary for policymakers. I'd prefer the term summary for decision makers. They're written, as it says, in a less technical language. They really focus on the most policy relevant elements of the assessment. The SPMs are written by the co-chairs of the assessment and the chapter lead authors, heavily peer-reviewed by the academic community, governments, and all other stakeholders. And at the end of the day, it's a document that's approved word by word. And I mean truly, every single word is approved in the summary. Many academics think this is terrible. Why would you allow governments to get involved in the approval? Ownership. Absolutely crucial that that final document is negotiated with the key academics and the key policy makers. And you end up with a document that has ownership both in the academic community and in the policy community. And within the scientific assessments, there's a number of things that really you typically tend to do. Look at the status and trend, whether it's climate or whether it's biodiversity. Crucial issue are the plausible futures. What could the future look like? Where is climate potentially going? What's likely to happen to biodiversity, ecosystems and their services? But a crucial thing, I mean, if I was to ask to give a talk and I could only meet one person in government, who would I go to? Wouldn't be the environment minister. That would almost be the last minister that I would talk to. They're going to be on my side before I talk. Their job is to look after the environment. I would go to the finance minister first. They're powerful in every country in the world. So I'd first go to the finance minister. Then I go to the agriculture minister, the energy minister. I'd go to the sectorial ministries that are causing the threat to biodiversity, causing the threat to climate change. And obviously my reason to talk to the environment minister is to help arm them in the ammunition to use with the finance minister, the agriculture minister, etc. And so therefore issues of values is really important. Economic and non-economic value. Absolutely crucial when you talk to a Minister of Finance. And as I've said, the last point, there's no question. I think everybody wants to know, okay, we know we've got a problem with climate change. We know we've got a problem with biodiversity, land degradation. Tell me what the options are to actually resolve the issue. This is the conceptual framework of IPBES. It's an interesting one. And the reason is, it's based on the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, but it's evolved the Millennium Ecosystem. If you look at all of the words in green, that's what I would call a Western science view of the world, and in black, and that is, we care about biodiversity and ecosystems, the bottom box. We care about how biodiversity and ecosystems, as it changes due to the direct drivers, and the indirect drivers, how does it affect ecosystem goods and services, and how does it affect human well-being? That was the structure that we came up with in the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. But then if you look at blue, it's basically an indigenous people's view of the world. Mother Earth, systems of life, nature's gift, living in harmony with nature. So what we've tried to do in IPBES is to recognize there are diverse worldviews. A very Western view of the world, very basic academic science, but there's also an indigenous persons and many religions, I would say, not just indigenous people, certainly in many religions. More of a view of don't destroy creation, basically. So we've tried to bring together in one conceptual framework diverse worldviews, and I think it works. It also works, as you can see, it can look at time, looking at time, you can look backwards and you can look forwards, and effectively different spatial scales from local to global. It tends to work at all scales. What we've put very crucially in the middle of this diagram, which we didn't have as explicitly in the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, was the role of governance, the role of institutions and the role of governance, absolutely vital. Well, what that meant was as soon as we came up with diverse worldviews, we had to think of how do you think about value and the diverse conceptualization of value. And on the right is a more classical market-dominated economic view of the world, going from nature's benefits, what's the economic value, what are the issues of market prices, what's the implications for GDP, cost-benefit analysis. Classical way of viewing it, where you can bring in, almost in a secondary way, some of the social issues and the environmental issues, and it's an important framework. It's worked for years, but it's nothing wrong with it, but it's limited. It's not wrong, it's limited. So what we've moved towards is a more diverse valuation system, where right from the beginning, with the diverse worldviews, you say we have to think about nature, nature's benefits to people and good quality of life. That says simultaneously, you don't preference economic thinking over social thinking and environmental thinking, and you therefore need an integrated valuation scheme, and you have to think through how can you bring together those things that you can put a monetary value on and those things that you can't put a monetary value on. So how do you do integrated valuation, basically? So, and that leads obviously to much more policy integration. So we've tended to sort of stress, look, economic valuation is important, both market and non-market. And the non-market value is normally worth far more than the market value for most ecological systems. But we're trying to move towards a much more integrated world to look at value. And so this leads to say, well, look, we're looking at nature, nature's contributions to people, good quality of life. So we have to think through about the non-anthropocentric, the intrinsic value. So things like the Gaia hypothesis, evolution and ecological processes. There's the instrumental value that we all think about, the market value of food, market value of timber, but there's also value in regulating services such as climate, air quality, storm surges, flooding, etc. And then there's the relational values, basically, otherwise often known as cultural values, cultural identity, sense of place, social cohesion. So we move the debate to thinking about value with this framework. We then recognise that we have to think through the evolution of thinking of ecosystem services. So we started with a Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, 4 services supporting, regulating, cultural and provisioning. The academic community's moved on from that, and they view the supporting services really as just part of nature and part of regulating services. So that's largely lost priority within the thinking even of ecosystem services. But we said, look, if you've got these diverse worldviews, nature's contributions for people has to embrace both ecosystem services and nature's gifts. And so we've now moved to this concept of nature's contribution to people, and we talk about the regulating services, which are very similar to the regulating ecosystem services. The non-material, which tend to be, the provisioning services become material, and the regulating literally become the non-material. So it's only an evolution of thinking, but it's a little bit more holistic, basically. And what we recognise is you can't put any of these ecosystem services into a single box. So what might basically be a material NCP, and I'll use food, it's also got incredible cultural aspects. Food isn't just giving us calories. There's huge cultural aspects to food, huge cultural aspects to water. And so what we're trying to recognise is that yes, you can put different sort of services into different boxes, but you've got to recognise it's a little bit more complex and a bit more holistic thinking is required. We also did, I think, a very nice assessment of what I call scenarios. We're all very familiar with what we call exploratory scenarios. What could the world look like in the next 50 years? It depends on economic growth, demographic change, socio-political considerations, technology, and changes in culture. And so what could that world look like for climate change or biodiversity? It's a crucial element in IPCC. Also, it's becoming a crucial element in IPBES. But then the other question is, what if I want a target, and the IPCC is looking at, I want to limit the world's change in climate to 2 degrees Celsius. So now you use target seeking scenarios. I know where I want to go, what are all of the different technology policies and behavioural changes, and there's myriads of them, that could get me to that target. Much harder to do in biodiversity. There's no single target that's as simple as a 2-degree target or 1.5 degree target in climate. Much, much harder. But then the two at the bottom is you can screen a policy with scenarios. How likely is it willing to work? And are there unintended consequences, which is the key thing one needs to look at. And then also you can do a retrospective. We put a target, a policy in place. We expect it to behave a certain way. How did it behave in hindsight? So the issue of scenarios, absolutely vital. And to be honest, there's only one simple message here. You have to integrate it into the policy cycle, and it must be participatory. It's a social process. You absolutely need all players at the table, the academic community, civil society, government. So when you're thinking through scenario planning, everyone answering their vision of the world, their formation of the world, what are their assumptions about the world. And so it's absolutely crucial to make sure that when one does scenario work, it's not just done in the academic community, it must engage civil society. So where are we on the Paris Agreement? Well, the first one, and this is too busy, but we are changing the directory of challenge, but not enough. Nowhere near enough. So effectively, everyone was happy that for 3 years in a row, 2014 to 2016, global emissions of carbon dioxide seem to have peaked and flattened. 2017 grew another 2.5%. We have not in any way come to the maximum of emissions of carbon dioxide. There are about 18 countries around the world that effectively are responsible for about 28% of the emissions, where over the last decade they have actually reduced their emissions. But you have to be very careful. The UK was really pleased 5 years ago that they were 20% below their 1990 emissions. What a success story, 20% below. Until I pointed out to the minister, if I counted embedded carbon in all our imports, our environmental footprint wasn't minus 18%, it was plus 18%. All we were doing was offshoring our footprint of absolutely no value to protecting the environment. The UK's got better now, it's pretty level now. But the point is, when you look at a footprint of a country, you have to look at both domestic emissions plus embedded carbon in all the imports and get credit for the exports that have got embedded carbon. So things are changing, but so where are we? This comes from IPCC very, very clearly. The black lines are the observations. The orange-pink line are theoretical climate models that account for all natural phenomena and all changes in anthropogenic drivers. So changes in albedo, changes in aerosols, changes in greenhouse gas emissions, they bring in solar radiation, etc. The blue line is where you only have a climate model that looks at natural phenomena, so solar variation, volcanic emissions, etc. And the message is very simple. You can, at both the global level and at the regional level, only simulate the observations with a climate model that includes the role of man, or humans I should say. And the other way to say it is, without bringing in anthropogenic activities, you cannot simulate the climate of the last 100 years. And this just shows temperature, but you can come to the same conclusions looking at things such as precipitation. We've now observed changes in the physical system, the biological system, and human systems such as agriculture is what I mean, management of water. We've seen changes that can actually be attributed to human-induced climate change all over the world. So this is a phenomena that is affecting, and there is now observational evidence of effects that can only be attributed to the observed changes in climate. Question is, what could happen in the future? Sea level rise is one. We could be fortunate and only over the next 100 years see a 1/4 of a metre sea level rise. I think, unfortunately, we're more unlikely or more likely to be closer to the 1 metre. But the other point about sea level rise is once it starts, it goes on for many, many centuries and millennia. So even if we could be on that bottom curve, the so-called low emissions curve, RC point 2.6, and it's only 1/4 of a metre by 2100. By 2200 it's 1/2 a metre, by 2300 it's almost a metre. So the problem is, even if we were to get temperature under control, sea level lags by several centuries. Once you start it moving, it doesn't stop at all quickly. This is to look at the future. The left-hand side is the low emissions, the right-hand side is the high emissions. Obviously, the low emissions, it plateaus at about 2 degrees Celsius. The high one is more like 5 degrees Celsius. The normal picture, the land warms more than the ocean, and the high latitudes, the Arctic region, which you guys know about, obviously, warms far more than the equatorial region. From precipitation, the models are much, much more uncertain in precipitation than they are on temperature, but classically the high latitudes get wetter and the subtropics get drier. The other perverse way to say it is the wet areas get wetter and the dry areas get drier. However, even in a single geographic location, pick the middle of America, pick them somewhere in Europe, there will be more extreme weather events, there'll be more heavy precipitation and less light precipitation. So in the same geographic area, you could expect more floods and more droughts in the same geographic location. And it's because the temporal variation in precipitation is quite pronounced. Clearly, we have to care about impacts into the future, and this just comes from IPCC. And what it basically says, as you get warmer and warmer, all of the threats get larger and larger. And even the so-called 2 degrees Celsius target of the Paris Agreement still shows very significant adverse effects on many of the things we care about: food production, water, human health, etc. And this really just summarizes it. Basically, you have to simultaneously consider the impacts of warmer temperatures, more heat waves, more variable precipitation, and certainly an increase in the frequency and intensity of both extreme weather events such as hurricanes, wind events, etc. And as this already says, and I'm not going to read it, we have to care about water availability and quality. We have to care about agricultural productivity, vector and waterborne diseases, things such as malaria and dengue as vector-borne, cholera as waterborne. We have to care clearly about the impact on biodiversity. It's a major threat. Up till now, it's predominantly been land use change and overexploitation of biodiversity that's a challenge. Climate change is likely to be the biggest challenge in the future. Let me miss that one. So the Paris Agreement, you all know about it. How do we limit it to 2 degrees Celsius and preferably 1.5? So that's the goal. This actually, quickly, and let me just put all of them up. To do it, you have to be on this thing at the bottom, RCP 2.6. We're most likely, at the moment, on a pathway between 6 and 8.5. We are definitely, at this moment in time, not on the pathway for the low emission scenario. We're on a pathway to one of the higher ones, basically. And so what do we need to meet the Paris Agreement? If you do absolutely nothing, that's the so-called baseline, we would actually go up from today's emissions around 40 gigatons per year, or just over it, about 47, I should be specific. We'd move up to over 80. Where do you need to be for a 2-degree target, let alone 1.5? By 2050, you need to be down at around 20. But even by 2030, you need to be actually down in about 40. So that's the challenge. How do you go against the baseline, business as usual, down to the blue line? Well, in Paris, which was good, the current projection might be a bit more optimistic than baseline. And we had some pledges, conditional and unconditional pledges from governments around the world, and that's where they are. Still way above the blue line, way above the blue line. So even with all the pledges under Paris that everyone was cheering about, yes, moving in the right direction. I'm strongly supportive, but the pledges today, even if they were fully implemented, do not get us to a 2-degree world. They get us to a world between 3 and 4 degrees Celsius. So this is the gap. We've got a huge gap. So in order to realize a 2-degree world, let alone a 1.5 degree world, we've got to fill that gap basically, and the rest is just... So, important, yes. totally inadequate pledges. A paper I put together recently with a couple of other people is the aspirational target will pass by 2030, and the 2 degrees threshold without stronger pledges will pass by 2050, 2060. And as I've said, we're already on a pathway to 3 to 4. The problem is all the integrated assessment models say we can hit 2 and we can hit 1.5. They assume we can have these so-called wonderful negative emissions that you can grow biomass and then capture the carbon dioxide and sequester it through carbon capture and storage. Personally speaking, I think we're in cuckoo land to rely on it. We've really got to focus on energy efficiency, focus on renewable energy, put a price on carbon to stimulate a low carbon economy, recognise actually we need to catalyse behaviour change. It won't just happen basically. All coal plants should be retired, especially the least efficient, and no new coal plant should be built without carbon capture and storage. I mean, very, very simple agenda, and we need to move on it aggressively, basically. What it also says is, and it is actionable, we can increase energy efficiency, we can do all of those things basically. We're not putting enough emphasis and investment on carbon capture and storage. It really needs more emphasis basically. And the last slide point is, because some of that is redundant, I apologise, but we have to also focus on non-energy emissions, especially from agriculture. It really is absolutely quite serious. So with biodiversity, all the same indirect drivers, obviously, as climate change, but the direct drivers are, as you can read quicker than I can say it, they range from habitat change to nutrients. To date, the really big issues have been habitat change and overexploitation. The big issue for the future will indeed be climate change. This comes out of a very old document, actually. It comes out of the Millennium Ecosystem, so where we looked at a whole series of biomes, different forest systems, different dryland systems, different aquatic systems. We looked at the 5 drivers and we said, you know, was it a major driver in the past? That's the colour. Yellow means that that particular driver wasn't very important. So climate change wasn't very important for most systems. And then the arrow says, what would happen over the next 50 years? Is it likely to become more or less important? And as you can see in climate change and in pollution, we really do believe that climate change and pollution will be a very, very major driver on literally all of these ecosystems as we go forward in the future. We do have the 17 UN Sustainable Goals. I think they're superb, personally, with 169 targets and however many indicators they finally come. If we could really implement this agenda, it would be a very, very different world. It really would transform our world. The challenge is to change the rhetoric around these 17 goals into something of reality. And what we must absolutely make sure we do is to recognise we don't have 17 individual goals. They all interact with each other. You can't think of the hunger goal without thinking about the energy goal or the water goal or the gender role of women in agriculture, especially in Africa. So the challenge is how to look at all of these goals and how they interact, basically. So yeah, there are 2 that are very specific to the environment, number 14 and number 15. But environment pervades all of these, basically. So in the Aichi targets, so you get on the left-hand side, just illustrative, you have a series of the Sustainable Development Goals, hunger, water, and then 2 biodiversity ones. And we've now started to link them, and I won't go through each of them in detail, to very, very specific Sustainable Development Goals. And so more and more we're starting to think, what are the interactions between the SDGs and the biodiversity targets? And in the last GBO dashboard, which was done by the Convention on Biological Diversity, they came up with, you know, these sort of arrows. If it's going number 1, is things are getting worse. We're actually moving away from the target. Red is we're just making no progress at all. Yellow says we're making some progress, but we won't achieve it. Green is we're actually on track. Boy, blue, we're actually going to exceed the target, basically. And this is what they've got for the 20 Aichi targets. Now, within each Aichi target, there's 20 of them, as you can There are sub-targets. And as you can see, predominantly, there's a lot of yellow there which says we're moving towards the target, but we're not going to make the targets by 2020. But there's a fair number of red arrows, and there's even some black arrows which says we're making no progress and we're even moving away from it. So if you look at that, it's both the good news that we're making, but we are not on schedule. In the same way we're not likely to meet the Paris Agreement without some really severe action. We're not going to make these 20 Aichi targets without really rethinking what policies do we need to deal with effectively. And so I just summarised it, sort of you can see what I've said there. So there's the mainstreaming targets, then there's the targets direct drivers, then there's the improved status, then the enhanced benefits and implementation. So that's the 20 Aichi target. And, and I'm not going to read it. Progress unlikely to achieve the target. Little or no progress. Little or no progress. Little or no progress. There's not very many saying, hey, we're making great progress. So this is our challenge. And in IPBES, we are looking at these at both the regional and sub-regional level. And I can't talk about the results, but there won't be anything that's inconsistent with this more global picture, basically. That, yes, we're moving in the right direction, but way too slowly, basically. Which really says, we've got to really think through when we think about values, about the economic part, which is only one part of value. I want to stress that. So, we've got to make absolutely sure non-market value is recognised in decision making as important and often more important than market value. We've really got to remove most of these perverse subsidies in agriculture, fisheries and energy. We need to pay landowners, in my opinion, payment for ecosystem service to manage the land that's actually sustainable. We need appropriate water pricing policies. Almost very few countries in the world actually appropriate price water. In many developing countries, as soon as you mention pricing on water, they throw you out of their office, basically. So again, we really need to think through purely on the economic thing, how to rethink the whole issue of economic. And so I've really talked about this. I've already gone through those 5 and how we're not meeting the Aichi targets. And so almost in conclusion now, climate change and loss of biodiversity are 2 of the greatest threats to a sustainable future. They really should be viewed as development and security issues, not simply environmental issues. And we don't have to convince ourselves. I think we all know that, but we do have to convince politicians, which also means taking a long-term view, basically. Most of the impacts of both climate change and loss of biodiversity are actually harmful. There's a few positives, but predominantly harmful. They undermine the sustainable development goals. We do need to transition to a low-carbon economy. The actual cost is trivial. If you actually look at the impacts of the cost of that transition, the cost of inaction exceeds the cost of action. It's a little dependent about what you think about the discount rate, but there's no question it will be cheaper in the long run to protect ourselves against climate change and loss of biodiversity. And the bottom line is there is no question the time for action is absolutely now. So we need strong research programs, national and international. We need strong assessment program, both nationally and internationally. I chair 2 for the United Kingdom on biodiversity. Absolutely crucial. They complemented the global assessments like the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment and IPBES. One doesn't replace the other. I would stress in Norway, well worth doing a national assessment, basically. There are different ways of dealing with it. Climate change and ozone depletion and even the open oceans are clearly issues of the global commons, whereas biodiversity, land degradation are issues of global importance, but they're not quite issues of global commons, and so one has to think about them a little bit differently, basically. I would argue the science policy interface has worked very well for stratospheric ozone depletion and reasonably well for climate change. but in biodiversity, land degradation, the research programs are typically a little bit weaker. The international assessment process until IPBES were very, very much weaker basically. And as I said, much of the challenge is at the local and national level, not just the global level. Therefore, we need integrated programs at the international level. We need much more integration of these programs, which isn't on here, at the national level. Universities working with funding agencies and journals, how to think through how to really push transdisciplinary research. And that's it. Thank you very much.
It's a small gift from us. It's a seat pad in wool for you.
Thank you.
Those cold evenings on the patio.
Bye.
We're running a bit late, so I think we'll do questions at the end for all the presenters. So during the panel, we'll open up for a couple of questions from the audience. Our next speaker is the Executive Secretary of the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, or GBIF, Donald Hoburn. Donald's career, I have to talk a bit about that as well, spans over 20 years in software development of biodiversity informatics. He is currently the Executive Secretary of GBIF, headquartered in Copenhagen. In his role, he is responsible for coordinating the activities of a global network for sharing biodiversity data, including 57 countries and many international organizations. He serves on the Executive Committee of the Encyclopedia of Life, the Steering Committee for the Group on Earth Observations Biodiversity Observation Network, GEOBON, and the Steering Committee for the Global Invasive Alien Species Information Partnership, GIASIP. He has also previously served as chair of the Taxonomic Database Working Group and the international organization responsible for development of standards for exchange of biodiversity data. Donald will be talking today about creating a transparent and verifiable knowledge base for biodiversity, and please join me in warmly welcoming Donald Hoburn.
Press the button. Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you very much indeed. It's a great pleasure to be here today, and I've really enjoyed the comments and the presentation so far. I hope that it'll be clear that I see the work that GBIF is involved in as being highly related to these, even if we're working in some ways in a much narrower and more technical area. GBIF was established in response to a recommendation from the OECD Megascience Forum back in 2001. It's open to all countries and fundamentally relies on government agencies signing a non-binding memorandum of understanding to focus on making biodiversity information more accessible, and at the governmental level to participate in the governance and to provide funding to make this global activity a reality. The vision for what we're doing is to develop a world in which biodiversity information is freely and universally available for science, society, and a sustainable future. And the little ladder of icons shown on this slide is meant to represent roughly where I believe we fit into a landscape of some of the intergovernmental and international activities that at the highest level, for those who would wish to see a world where the Sustainable Development Goals were achieved, a planet I would certainly like to see, then we need to be able to ultimately provide the kind of knowledge base that will underpin that so that we can have knowledge-based decisions and planning. And so GBIF is trying to provide organized access to fundamental evidence relating to the patterns and the distribution and other aspects of biodiversity in a way that can then feed into global data activities such as those organized by Group on Earth Observations through GEOBON and up into IPBES, the CBD and the SDGs. If you think about some of the goals globally around big data, particularly the Group on Earth Observation System of Systems concept, the idea is to bring together spatio-temporally organized information in ways that allow the different complex systems around the Earth to be understood as a whole. And if we think about this, one of the societal benefit areas identified by GEO for focus is relating to biodiversity. And yet, the opportunities we have to make biodiversity a real module in such a system have, at least up to this point, been rather limited. We know the boundaries of protected areas, we can map vegetation and ecosystem boundaries. We have a certain amount of other information in different categories, but very little that is sufficiently standardized and organized for us to be able to plug it in the same way that we might wish to be able to do around models of climate and agriculture and transport and energy. So if I want a world in which the Sustainable Development Goals can be achieved, I believe I need a world in which, for the biodiversity-related aspects, which do cut across all areas, that we have the kind of information available that could enable a benign, positive thinking policymaker to make the kind of decisions that rely on appropriate trade-offs and allow for a future in which food security, conservation of biodiversity, energy and peace and gender equality and all of the other aspects can be addressed. And trade-offs will be required, and therefore we do need somehow to be able to assign some kind of biodiversity values to different portions of land and to their alternative futures. I've mentioned already GEOBON, the Group on Earth Observation's Biodiversity Observation Network. One of the focus products that group is working on in response to the essential climate variables is the idea of a set of more or less, well, set of standardized variables that help us to characterize the different states of biodiversity and to allow us to identify and discriminate how those states differ in ways that matter to us. And there's a great deal that's been going on over the last few years, many, many workshops and discussions, and a lot of very circular debate about how this may work, because it is a very complicated issue. Certain things I think are starting to come out of this very clearly. Some of them are perhaps not directly measuring biodiversity, particularly the aspects that relate to remote sensing, but are certainly getting us closer to measuring important aspects of natural systems, such as vegetation height. At the same time, there's been a recognition that we do need a framework that gets at allowing us to present as a variable across time and space the most fundamental aspects of biodiversity, of the variation and variability of species and communities in different areas. And that a lot of it comes down to what I've tried to represent here. I grew up in the UK on the East Coast. The left-hand side represents some of the things I remember seeing as a keen amateur naturalist as a child. Lots and lots of shorebirds, sandlings and other birds, vast amounts of starlings. I remember seeing burnet moths and quite a lot of stoats and weasels. I remember seeing pseudoscorpions and getting very excited about them. The same place, going back now, some of those things are still there, but often in very much lower numbers. That's the last time I saw a weasel, and it didn't look very healthy. There's still pseudoscorpions there, and now there's little egrets. Now, some of those things may be significant, others may be much less significant, but there are differences in the state of the organisms that are very readily observable, and much more also, doubtless, in the things that I wasn't observing. And I'm sure that any one of us can think of how the suite of species has varied through our lifetimes in the areas that we've known, and how they've varied in the different places that we've lived. And if we want to understand biodiversity and put it into this system, we need to understand these things, both in space and in time. And ultimately, we need a way that we can start to bring together the evidence we have, to organize it from the standpoint of quality and fitness for use, and be able to provide matrices based on land units or space-time cubes that help us to talk about these differences and how they change. And if you can just imagine having data like this at a fine enough scale, and that's the big challenge, both for space and time, then many of the things that we spend a great deal of time talking about in ecology and more generally around biodiversity and the impacts of invasive species or conservation really relate to patterns and signals that you would see in a matrix like this. Species changing in relative abundance, disappearing. So if we could observe the world more like this, it would be a fantastic thing, and I believe it would be a fundamental underpinning for the kind of Earth-observing system of systems that's implied by GEOS. So I'll come back to GBIF and our role, which is not as grand yet as being able to produce a fine-scale view for all species of their distribution and abundance in all parts of the world. GBIF, as I mentioned, is a governmental partnership. We also have participants that are international organizations somehow related to biodiversity information management. The countries that you can see here are those that have currently signed the Memorandum of Understanding, many of them as early as 2001. Those that are marked in green are the ones that are actually funding the activity, currently at a level of around 3 million euros a year for the centrally funded shared activities, which include informatics, capacity development, and all of the aspects of the governance and meeting structures. What we're trying to do is to interact with all the many sources of information which tell us about biodiversity. And most of what I'm talking about is, I admit, a very simple and basic aspect of what we could know, the distribution and occurrence of species in time and space and what evidence we have for that. But we treat those evidence points as sources for getting back to other information, specimens, field research, literature, molecular work, etc. And all of these things that are represented along the bottom here are some of the sources of information that we have. And they're all important for us in understanding different groups and different aspects of biodiversity. But they're scattered. Many of them are not in a digital form, and certainly they're not well standardized or easy to put together. On the other hand, and this is in a sense coming back to the kind of higher level goals we may have, this information gets used by different people in many different ways. We use it obviously for the pure research of species themselves, taxonomy and ecology and all of the questions that interest many of us. But the relevance of biodiversity to our food security, to human health, to animal health, the understanding of what's going to happen with natural and human systems as climate change takes place or other types of alteration come into land use is often highly influenced by a good understanding of what the interactions are going to be with biodiversity. And we need therefore to be able to connect up all of these sources with all of these users. And that's really broadly why GBIF was brought into existence. I would characterize our role a little more narrowly as being particularly three things. First of all, to remove obstacles, both technical and sociological, around collaboration in sharing and use of biodiversity data. My experience in countries where I've worked on these things has been that many different agencies, many different NGOs and other parties are busy gathering up bits of information from multiple sources, perhaps paying each other for data, in order to be able to answer their questions for managing a protected area or thinking about the risks around pest species in agricultural systems. And it's very inefficient. They're all duplicating work and having to churn through similar cleaning of data and processing. So we want to clear that out and actually make this whole thing much more frictionless. Secondly, and that's what I'm going to talk about mostly for the rest of this presentation, We want to provide an organized view of the evidence of recorded occurrence of any species in time and space. So that includes microbes, plants, animals, marine, terrestrial. It would include also domesticated species to the degree that they're participating in environment and in systems. And thirdly, and the part which probably is closest to why GBIF was really brought into existence, given the strong engagement of natural history collections at the beginning, is to support a more intelligent access to the holdings of the world's natural history collections, to support taxonomy, to support cross-institutional curation and discovery of new organisms that may currently be hidden and scattered and not in contact with researchers. But I'm going to focus today, although all of these are important for us, and capacity building in different parts of the world around data management is a key part as well. I'm going to focus on the second of these right now. We are an open data infrastructure, and by that I mean that we do everything we can to remove barriers to people being able to reuse data. Now, there are many personal issues, many institutional issues, which can make this difficult. But fundamentally, until we can get data in a form that is increasingly being referred to as fair, which means it's findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, we're not going to be able to put together the big data systems to answer the questions we have. And so GBIF is promoting sharing of data with the most liberal data licenses possible. We always try to ensure that due attribution is given back to data sources, but it's much easier for everybody concerned if the data are effectively more or less put into the public domain. We manage use of digital object identifiers around all data objects and all data downloads to make it easy to trace back and understand how a published piece of research that based on data through the network ties back to the original sources. And we play a part in a number of international activities around open data and the development of relevant data standards. And if you visit the GBIF website, you can download the annual science review, which provides an overview of hundreds of papers each year, which actually have been based in different ways upon use of this contributed global pool of data. The kind of streams of information that I'm thinking about are ultimately more or less anything that will tell us that we have evidence that a particular species was found at a particular time, a particular place, but we want to be able to trace back to all of the associated information and to be able, as far as possible, to bring forward the relevant structure that may be important for understanding the significance of those observations. So, for example, there are large numbers of observations coming from a relatively small number of animals, especially birds, with radio transmitters attached and sending signals at regular intervals. The fact that they all come from one individual, and therefore you can see a lot about resource use and movements, tells you something very different from a vegetation survey, for example. And similarly, it's good to be able to trace back to know where a specimen or a DNA sequence is actually held. At present, we're talking here about just under 1 billion such occurrence records, which in many ways is it's just a drop in the ocean. If you look at this map, which is all of those that are georeferenced, overlaid to indicate density, it's very clear that there are major portions of the world, which largely reflects the map of participation, where we're still not engaging in the way that we would like. Nevertheless, at some scales, and particularly for birds and vascular plants, and increasingly in many regions for groups like butterflies and dragonflies, the level of data and the continuing growth in data year by year is sufficient for a lot of work to see patterns and to start seeing change. And if you visit the GBIF website, you can view these data and download them in all sorts of ways, by species, by data set, by publisher country, by country of interest, etc. So what I would say at this point is that we have an infrastructure. That infrastructure is building on open standards and an increasing adoption by many, many different organizations and institutions to share their data in a compatible way. I believe that we're now technologically in a position where we could very easily scale up another order or magnitude or two today, so 10, 50 billion records without actually having any difficulty based on our current structures. And we're at a point in the history of biodiversity science where the prospects of gaining very large streams of information, both from environmental sequencing, from remote sensing of canopy trees, etc., could actually increase these volumes very fast in the next few years, and I believe we're ready for that. If we look at the data today, as I've mentioned, you can see patterns. You can see patterns even though this is a big mashed up mosaic of data from many different sources. These three here, these three well-known butterflies, this just simply shows for year by year the proportion of all records of butterflies from these countries for those years that were identified to each of these species. And I don't want to put too much weight on this because there's probably something very peculiar about the way that lepidopterists just manically observe things which causes better standardization than would apply if I dragged together random random records of newts or something like that. But even without fully standardized data for level of effort and comparability, signals can be clearly seen. We recognize, however, that, and GBIF up to this point I would say has a reputation as being a big pile of presence records. We can tell you, yes, somebody said they saw something there, we've got no idea what else was there, we've got no idea whether the same species was common 10 kilometers away or anything like that. We have, however, in the last few years started to extend further in this direction. And if you imagine, or indeed much of the data that's flowed into GBIF over the years has effectively, in the early years, was denatured to bring it in. It may have come from a survey where there was a transect, where somebody regularly perhaps counted certain species over and over and over, following a common protocol with one used somewhere else. This could be vegetation plots, there are transects through reefs, it can be particular kinds of bird counts, it could increasingly be metagenomic activity, and from these we have much more standardized signals that are much closer to that view that I showed early on of the kind of grid that would represent metadata, represent biodiversity as part of an Earth observing system. So GBIF now is already starting to bring in increasing quantities of data that we call here sample event data that does provide this higher structure. Observations of species that come from the same place as part of a single survey using a common method that can then be compared with that from other localities. And obviously this kind of information is the raw basis on which in many cases we do understand local changes in populations. We're trying to bring this together too at a global scale. This is my last slide. I just wanted to say a little more about this because up to now, I think a lot of what we've done through the global network, and many people have been involved working on the standards, working on the technologies, cleaning data, helping others to get their data into appropriate formats. We've done a great deal to start building the volume and to solve the problems of transforming different kinds of information into a compatible form. The real challenge going forward is that we need to have better mechanisms that tie these data sets together with the ongoing life of research communities. We've up to now been much worse than I would like to be at getting not just feedback about issues that people see in particular parts of the data, but actually moving to a world where there is continuous curation and annotation, and as we come to understand more about the data, we're actually improving into the future rather than just improving what we know about the current copy that will get replaced in 6 weeks' time. So just finally, I'd like to say that what GBIF is doing and what many others are doing to try to organize scientific data in a form that is as open as possible and as easily brought into something like an Earth observing system of systems is, I think, one of the most fundamental things we can all be doing to address some of those issues that were mentioned earlier around transdisciplinary, multidisciplinary activity. And it's not the only aspect that ties things together, but organising all of our information in time and in space, and increasingly according to common standards and good vocabularies, is a key step in moving us forward. Thank you.
As well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And we'll see you in the panel afterwards.
Great.
Now, guys, we're having a short break. In my household, we operate with two different types of times. It's either Mexican time or Norwegian time. And when I say it's on Norwegian time, it means that we have to be back in a certain, or like prompt on the time. So if we can now take just 15 minutes, Norwegian time, 15 minutes, we'll go outside and you will find some refreshments, get that blood sugar level up, and then come back again. Thank you. the auditorium. If you could also sit down, then we're getting there. Perfect. Okay. So I trust that you had a good break stretching your legs. Impressive that you 200 people managed to get out of the room and in again with a muffin in such a short time. We have 3 other speakers lined up for you in addition to the panel, so let's just dive straight in. First up, after the break, is John Linnell. John is a senior researcher at the Norwegian Institute for Nature Research, or NINA. His research focuses on interdisciplinary approaches to understanding the complex relationships between humans and wildlife, especially large herbivores and large carnivores. John's presentations today is titled In the Crossfire, Commercial Interests and Biodiversity Research. John, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Do we have a little clicker thing?
Yes.
There
you go.
Okay, thanks. So in kind of science policy debates, there's lots of talk about upscaling and downscaling. And the previous talks were all the upscaled ones. Now I'm in the downscaling. So the perspectives from basically a simple, maybe not quite so humble, but these are simple scientists trying to make this little contribution to making the world a better place. So what's the one direction? What I work on is the big, furry, cuddly, charismatic end of the biodiversity scale. Not the little slimy, buggy things, but the big, furry things. But as well as being cuddly and charismatic and cute, these animals can also be highly controversial. And that's really what I'm talking about today. But my work focuses on wildlife and very much in an international context. Europe, Central Asia, Southern Asia is my arena. Just to put this talk into context, it's very important to understand where I work. And I work at an institute, the Norwegian Institute for Nature Research, which is not an academic institution. It is an independent foundation, over 240 people, and we live entirely on external funding. So virtually everything we do is driven by projects and contracts. And this is a totally different thing to the academic reality. But we're bigger than your average consultancy. So we occupy this sort of intermediate status between the consultancy world and the academia world. And this gives us a fairly special position in the science policy interface. With the species that I work on, the crisis in wildlife conservation is not driven by ignorance, right? We know elephants and rhinos have a problem. We know pandas are endangered. It's not there that the problem lies. The conservation contexts and challenges come because of conflicts. These conflicts are with the species themselves, they're the opportunity costs imposed by conservation, there's conflicts of interests, and even conflicts of identity and values, where conservation will or will not fundamentally challenge someone's life project. As a consequence, the lack or the motivation for practices which are not sustainable is because somebody is benefiting from a non-sustainable practice, right? Somebody wins. It's often hard to know who it is. Is it an interest group? Is it a person? It may be somebody distant or close, but somebody pretty much always wins from cutting down the rainforest, harvesting ivory, and killing rhinos. So it's not the ignorance, it's the conflict. It's the people here. We have to understand what this conflict is. The problem is, these people don't have an interest in change. So anything which threatens to change their status quo will be challenged. And the extent to which can knowledge, which is what our scientists do, if that challenges their benefits, they are going to fight back against that change. Which means that any time we're doing relevant science, it is going to be controversial and we are going to be in the crossfire. If we're not doing something controversial, we're doing the wrong thing. Okay, this is the reality which me and my colleagues can kind of work inside. Where are we? Sorry, there. Which button do you press here, guys? There's way too many buttons here. Thank you. This kind of thinking was fairly absent in the early iterations of IPBES. One can almost say there's a certain naivety there, a focus on benefits, right? Benefits all the time. But I think the new iterations of IPBES are much more embracing the conflicts and the context dependence of conservation. So I was really happy to read this latest piece in Science, which Bob and others wrote just a few weeks ago. It really made some small changes, but I think they were changes in the direction of a more realistic grasp of the issues really facing biodiversity. Some of the examples of these kind of controversies which I work on: in Norway, we have the conflicts between large carnivores and livestock grazing. We have conflicts with moose. Some people perceive it as a hunting resource, others perceive it as a damaging thing in the forest. Other people driving cars perceive it as a real problem. Animals can have benefits and costs in the same place and time. It's very complex. We have other major conflicts, for example, with a salmon conflicting with hydropower, with aquaculture, and here you have very strong commercial interests who are coming into conflict with conservation of a species like a salmon. Even you have green-green conflicts, the green of alternative energy versus the green of conserving wildlife. Many conflicts here. And it's not just the commercial interests that we have conflicts with. We also have conflicts with the conservation side, with the animal welfare side. The tools that we use to generate knowledge, like putting a radio collar onto a carnivore, can be incredibly controversial, triggering all sorts of negative feedback. And actions for kind of conservation, like conserving Arctic foxes by captive breeding, is probably one of the most controversial projects I ever worked on in my whole life, because we're simply taking these animals out of the idealized nature and putting them into captivity. So you get all sorts of stuff thrown at you from all sides in this world. In a way, we often joke about it that you want to get equal amounts of stuff, of kind of shit thrown at you from both sides to keep, then you're doing a good job. The way these conflicts are felt by us are kind of diverse. You can really expect that you're going to get strung out in the media the whole time. The media is a fantastic place for people to pour out venom, especially when it comes to social media. All their frustration, anger, whatever, can flow out. And they can create these universes where you're the target and everything is flowing at you. The trial by media and social media is the daily life. You also get quite a lot in your face. Many people are very angry. We get legal challenges. Our colleagues working on salmon, for example, have been challenged to produce documentation going back over 20 years. People is trying to obstruct the process of doing science by putting legal challenges in place. We get all sorts of institutional and collegial attacks. There's always a professor, an expert, somebody, somewhere that can be pulled out to defend a certain point of view. Often radical, often totally out of context of his own expertise, but these guys are cheap. You can find somebody in, bring them up, and they stand up there with all of their ponders as Professor so-and-so, pouring out basically rubbish, trying to obstruct the process of science. Politicians are some of the worst in here. It's not an uncommon practice in our world that we have politicians who are undermining our credibility, questioning our results, or simply ignoring them. And then we have this whole universe of the post-Trump era. Fake news, alternative facts, conspiracy theories. And if it hadn't been tragic, these would actually been quite entertaining. To see the creativity that people can put into building up alternative realities and connecting dots, which actually have no connection at all. It's fantastic. But also it's tragic. If anyone has read or seen The Merchants of Doubt, you will be familiar with all of these tactics of how business or special interests try to obstruct science's job. And we are exposed to all of this in our work. That is simply what it means to work on policy-relevant science. So the question is, how do we, at an institute like NINA, navigate a minefield? How do we live in this minefield day after day after day? And we did some brainstorming over this in the build-up to today. And we really broke it down to two categories of support. One of the institutional aspects and one of the individual. Institutionally, we have a foundation which is independent. We can say what we like, and no state body can actually tell us to shut up immediately. So we are independent. We have a director who backs us up. And I think we are incredibly lucky there to have a director who is not afraid for us to go out there and stand up and challenge things. She supports us. We also have colleagues around us. We work in teams. We very rarely work alone. And that provides an incredible support when you're out there taking this stuff. It can often be personal. You know that you have people around you who support you, who also can maybe share the blame because any product coming from us is a team effort. We also have these specialized helping functions like the veterinarians and media people who can be around us and give us that technical support in certain contexts to actually stand up for the points of view that we come across with. And finally, we have a merit system at NINA which doesn't simply count the number of nature papers or science papers, but it actually values the time that we put into dealing with media and controversy and speaking in public and all those everyday little things that take up so much time and simply do not take part in any conventional academic evaluation. Individually, we simply live here. This is what we are used to. And I think it's very difficult for many people fresh out of academia into our world to actually handle this, because they simply aren't prepared to have so much bullshit basically thrown at them every day, okay? This is our life, and we work here. I think we just simply learn how to handle this, how to communicate, how to deal with people in a way that tries to maintain credibility, but still keeps you alive and sane. But also, we back up our work with publication. And this idea that your work is published is an incredible quality control and support that when you're being controversial out there, you can put something down on the table and say, I'm not simply coming with an opinion, but I'm coming with something which actually has support. So there's many strategies here. The other thing which I wanted to share today was how we live or how we experience the science policy interface. And what have we learned from working in our position? I think there's probably three key messages here. One is that there's many different types of science, right? The science is everything from pure research to very, very applied. And working on these things in the interface, I think you learn that the interdisciplinary stuff, the team stuff, and often some of the very trivial basic stuff is what has the greatest impact, rather than often the most far-reaching kind of work in theory. The other thing we've learned is that there's many different types of policy. There's not one place with a door that says policy on it. Policy exists in many different places and scales. You have the private sector with whole businesses, corporations and lobbyists. You have the whole official structure going from the public through users to their organizations to national agencies, national governments, international agencies, international government. Each of these requires a different strategy and a different approach. And it's only by understanding which is the relevant policy place to talk to can you actually achieve goals. Sometimes you need to talk to an individual farmer. Other times you have to go and talk to the European Commission. Different things have a different address. We also have to realize that there are many different interfaces, okay? That the interface is not simply publishing a paper and expecting someone to read it in a journal. Because managers, end users, the public, nobody actually reads journals. Even scientists don't read journals much anymore. We haven't got time for that. So bridging the interface is much more about finding creative ways to take your knowledge and take it through the whole way, to actually carry it across that bridge into the places where it's actually needed. It takes time. Wrapping up, one of the things that I think we have become more and more aware of at NINA in recent years is that working on applied science isn't a discipline, it's a profession. And it's a profession that includes many disciplinary components, but it's also just a way of understanding your role and a way of adapting your behavior. It's a different objective in life. It's not the conventional academic merit system, it's not the survival of a consultant. It's something in between, but it is a profession. And it's a very poorly articulated profession. And I don't think we even have any internal consciousness around it. It's more sort of an unofficial thing that we have brought along from our origins. But it's very much a way of interacting with users and end users, which is somehow is very, very important. And I think it's something we need to actually focus on more and more as we change, as people retire and move out of the system. Our own institutional memory has to make this kind of professionality much more defined and explicit. Two more slides. What is our Achilles heel? For us, as an institute who depend almost entirely on external funding, the Achilles heel is funding. We rarely experience political or stakeholder influence in our findings. So largely we're free to come to the conclusions that our data gives us, which is a good thing, because it's not always that way in science. But what we don't have is control over our funding. So the system can define the questions that we work on. And if the system does not want us to work on certain questions, it simply doesn't fund us. And all our funding, well, not all, but most of our funding is ultimately public, coming from different sectors and different pathways, but it's largely public funding under the control of politicians. And this is how they're able to control us, is by simply focusing us away from the questions that they don't want us to actually work with. So this is also much the reality of working in our sector. Academia maybe has some more freedom of funding, but we certainly are very much victims of the funding cycles. The final thing is, where is the weakest link in the science policy interface? And I think that we have got very good at dealing with the public and end users on the ground and technical agencies. But the real weakest link is when it comes into the highest level on that kind of policy hierarchy, the politicians. And here, I don't think any of us have not had a day when we have not been frustrated at the behavior and decisions that the politicians make. They're served up with science, they're given the policy options, they're given face-saving trade-offs which can get them out of their sticky situation. And somehow, like lemmings, they jump off the cliff into a controversial mess, blind to everything apart from, well, I'm not sure. I don't understand them. But they seem to have this great skill to get themselves into trouble without any scientific backing and survive. And this is really where we have to understand more. How does politics work? And this is like, as Bob says, we don't really understand this, okay? But also, it's quite important, I think, here to point out that sometimes our frustration at this field causes tensions between our professional integrity and our personal integrity. Because all of us go into this world because we actually want to make the world a better place, okay? None of us are neutral to the outcome for biodiversity. We care. Right? We do our job because we care. At the same time, we're having to be professionals working in a very controversial field that requires a certain way of behaving. So probably the biggest challenge that most of us have is, how do we balance and reconcile these tensions which appear between the professional integrity and the personal integrity? And this is no answer, right? This is just sort of an observation from a lifetime of working out there in that crossfire, in that minefield of policy relevant science. So that was it. Just a little kind of an input from the ground, how it is to be out there. So thank you. Okay, I have to dewire.
Well, I feel like we're not, the surprise element is sort of lacking, but okay. It's a sit pad for you as well.
Thank you.
Yep, thank you so much. So next up is Francesco Cherubini. He's tackling the all-important question of, is mitigation a challenge to biodiversity? Francesco is professor at the Industrial Ecology program at NTNU. His research focuses on climate change impacts from anthropogenic emissions, land use change, and analysis of biomass and bioenergy systems. He serves as a lead author for the IPCC Special Report on Land and Climate Change, and is leading the Global Warming Task Force on the UNEP SETAC Life Cycle Analysis. So let's warmly welcome Francesco when he's ready. Stage is yours.
Thank you. I think now I'm ready.
Perfect.
The control.
There's a clicker here.
Yes. Thank you for your introduction. With my presentation, we are going to have a look a bit at the interlinkages between climate change and land management, and possible side effects or co-benefits with respect to biodiversity. We have already heard something from the presentation from Bob Watson regarding some of those aspects. Here we are going to have a closer look to the implications that mitigation can have on biodiversity. But first, let's remind us that when we speak about interlinkages between climate change and biodiversity, we operate along two major dimensions, adaptation and mitigation. We can have side effects from both of them, both from inaction or from taking actions. Regarding the context of adaptation, we have, of course, that a changing climate can alter ecosystem functioning, species richness and distribution. Regarding mitigation, land-based mitigation actions can have side effects on biodiversity. Let's go briefly on adaptation first. This picture was already presented from Bob before, and I want to make the same point. what will happen in the future will most likely be determined from how good we will be in cutting our global emissions of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere in the next couple of decades. We can have a temperature impact by the end of the century which can go from about 1 degree Celsius up to more than 5. And of course, different temperature levels can have different impacts on some sensitive areas that we have in our Earth systems. And the unique and threatened systems and vulnerable ecosystems can suffer of high risks, of very high risk, even at relatively low temperature threshold. So adaptation is one aspect of the domain, but is also providing some insights, because if you have a look at this picture, which is taken from the last IPCC assessment report, we can appreciate a comparison between adaptation in terms of speed at which species can migrate and climate change velocity, the speed at which the climate is changing. And you can see here that for different species, you have different ranges in terms of adaptation via migration, the speed at which species can move. And it is evident that if the climate is changing at a rate that is faster than the speed at which species can migrate or adapt, then you may have risks of extinctions, either at a regional level or at a global level. And here should also consider the wide ranges that we have here, both in terms of species migration velocity and climate change, rate of climate change, because climate is changing faster over flat areas than global average, for instance, right? So again, we need to take into account the importance to have case-specific consideration, to take into account the specific context that we have to move towards regional or national assessments, because you may have large spatial heterogeneities. And we should move away from a rhetoric which is based on one size fits all, because we need to have different solutions in different contexts. And therefore, adaptation we cannot simply rely on adaptation as well. We need to cut emissions. We need also to act on mitigation. And if we continue with our emission trends under a business as usual case, without any significant success in terms of climate change, of mitigation of global emissions, we will achieve by the end of the century a temperature target of 5 degrees or more. If we want to stay below the 2 degree target, then we need to be in the green or yellow pathway here and gradually bring our emissions of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere down to 0 by the end of the century. So in the Paris agreements, you have the specific notion of trying to achieve a net zero balance in terms of carbon emissions, where a few remaining emissions should be compensated by negative emissions, which is, of course, something challenging under many points of view. I would like now to give you some examples of what what climate change mitigation is expected to be from a land management point of view under the variety of possible future scenarios that are envisioned by the integrated assessment models, and for simplicity we can say from future scenarios from the IPCC, right, which are grouped in the shared socioeconomic pathways, which try to simulate possible alternative futures in terms of different drivers of developments in our society. For instance, population, economic growth, dietary regimes, technological developments, land use regulations, and you have a variety of scenarios that you go from SSP1, which is the sustainability pathways. It's the green transition, very successful, very optimistic scenarios, down to SSP5, which on the other hand is a world where we continue to have a massive development of fossil fuels with many challenges to implement climate change mitigation, with different scenarios here in between. And if you see the projections coming out from those scenarios and you compare the baseline land use dynamics with the land use dynamics which are compatible with the 2-degree target, you immediately see the major differences. You have, in particular here, you have the tremendous increase which is expected in energy crops, in the amount of land that is used for production of bioenergy crops. Bioenergy is key in any climate change mitigation scenarios. If we want to achieve low temperature targets, we need to increase the amount of products, materials, energy that we produce from the land. And of course, we are, and it's quite substantial, because if you want to have some numbers, we go from 120 million hectares in SSP1 up to 1,500 million hectares in SSP4. And of course, we have limited land resources. We have a lot of demands from our land. And this means that we have an integrated context, because this land needs to come from somewhere. Where is this land coming from? This land that is used for production of energy needs to come from, part of it, from a decline in the land that we use for production of food, feed, fibers. So we need to develop agricultural practices in a way that we can guarantee food supply and food stability. We can have agricultural intensification, optimization of the food value chain, and also by a decline in the land that is used for pasture, through changes in diets, reduction in meat consumption. But if we don't have regulations in terms of land management, in terms of prevention of deforestation, especially in the tropical band, which you are more prone to the risks of deforestation, then there are good chances that part of these land conversions will involve the displacement of natural forest and unprotected areas. And here you can easily understand the interlinkages that you have with biodiversity. Whenever you have a change in land use, but especially if you have a deforestation. Now, those numbers are produced from top-down approaches, from integrated assessment models that are big generic models that try to couple our society with Earth system. They know how much land we have in our planet, you have the different land uses, and then they try to solve the puzzle by combining all different pieces together. And it is good to do what we can say is a reality check, to see how much we can how much of this certain amount of land or energy can match with the predictions that we have from other type of studies, which on the other hand start from the bottom by mapping, for instance, with GIS or using specific databases to see how much resources we have available. And this is the core of many of the discussions we have in the scientific community, because there is a large divergence in the different studies. From the SSPs, we see that for 2100, we will have a demand for primary bioenergy of 250 as usual, if we behave well. SSP1, the most optimistic scenario. If we are good in reducing consumption, we have most efficient systems. And if we are not behaving well, we can have almost twice the demand to achieve the 2-degree target. So we have this range compared to a baseline of 50 as usual, which is the level of bioenergy that is used today in the world. If you compare it with one study which is based on the global assessment of land degradation dataset, so how much potential we have for production of bioenergy from the land that is current under degradation processes and is not suitable for production of agriculture, then you have a different number which still can fit into SSP1 projections. On the other hand, if you take another study which is implementing stricter sustainability criteria, then you see that you have quite different estimates. You have these sort of contrasting opinions or results in the scientific community, which has led to perhaps the most controversial figure of the IPCC, which was this tremendous range for the estimates of global primary biomass energy supply, which can envision, because you have different criteria that you can adopt for biodiversity conservation, for sustainability, for other constraints. And you can appreciate especially the range that you have for production of dedicated crops from land. Therefore, we have all different pieces that needs to go together. We have land competitions, we have a variety of products that are produced from the land. Because if there is something that we can learn from the different IPCC scenarios, is that we need to increase the production of products from the land. We need to rely more on land to achieve climate change stabilization targets and to get rid of fossil fuels. But we need to know how to best manage the land resources and bioresources that we have available. And I want to close with the positive outcomes, right? Because we should not only consider the negative side effects. You can also have co-benefits. You can have mitigation actions that can co-deliver across a variety of impact categories. This is one example taken from a recent study published in Science, where you know that in the US there is a large production of bioethanol from corn in the Midwest. If you replace some of this cornfield with switchgrass, which is a perennial grass, which can also use for production of bioethanol, then you see that you can increase a lot of indicators for biodiversity, for different species compared to maize or corn fields. And you are at an intermediate level with respect to natural prairie grasses. So we are moving towards the recovery of this land. So there are the opportunities to identify co-benefits and options that can co-deliver under different indicators. And this is the task that we are undertaking under the special report on climate change and land, where I have the pleasure to serve as a lead author, thanks to the support of NTNU Sustainability. And we have here the challenge, and you can understand the challenge if you see the title of this report, right? It's 3 lines here. Special report, climate change on desertification, land degradation, sustainable land management, food security, greenhouse gas fluxes in terrestrial ecosystems. So the challenge is to understand how the different climate change mitigation options can co-deliver across the variety of those. The report will be published in September 2019. And it's, I think, one of the first in which we can have a sort of IPCC point of view on land use management, which was a bit set aside from previous report. That's it for my presentation, and I thank you for your attention. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Where the knowledge gaps are in biodiversity research. Bernt Erik Sæther is the director of the Center for Biodiversity Dynamics, also known as the CBD, which is to digress a popular abbreviation. Anyways, the Center for Biodiversity Dynamics is located at NTNU and is a Norwegian Center of Excellence. The principal research aim of the center is to predict how changes in the environment will affect biological diversity of genes, species, and communities. Sæther is also a member of the steering board for the division Energy, Resources and Environment in the Research Council of Norway. Bernt Erik, whenever you're ready.
Thank you very much for being and also coming down from the ivory tower of academia. I will try to tell you that some of the things that we are thinking of have some practical use. We don't need to have any practical use because we have politicians that have said that it's okay to do basic science. But what I will do here is that I will show that there are some fundamental questions that we are lacking understanding of. And I think that will be extremely important in order to concretize the biodiversity actions that are needed to be taken in order for things to change. And of course, when you are the last speaker before the discussion, you are allowed to provoke a little bit, and I will do that. The first premise
of my talk is that humans are part of nature. This is, of course, self-evidence, at least in a country like Norway. But what you see here is that biodiversity, of course, it determines ecosystem functions, it determines ecosystem services. And you don't need to publish in Nature in order to show that that is true. And that will, of course, be affected by global change. One of the big things, I think, has been the reason for why IPCC has had such an influence is that they have been able to concretize, they have been able to give some practical consequences of what will happen in the future. So what I'm going to say is that management relevant biodiversity research must include a human perspective. And what does that mean? That means that we have to say something of what will happen, because we are interested in the future. That is what we are relating to. Therefore, conservation biology as a general and biodiversity assessment must develop as a predictive science. If I throw this on the floor, some physicists here can exactly calculate how long time it will take before it reaches the ground, how far it will come from me. If you cut down a forest, no one can tell us how many species are lost, how many individuals are lost, and what consequences that will have for the surrounding areas. That's why I think the point made by the previous speaker is relevant. In order to make predictions, we have to generalize some principles that can be achieved to make predict biodiversity changes. And what I will focus on today is changes in land use. And this is very important now, because we get the politicians that we deserve. And we got those politicians that are interested in what we are interested in. What we see now, at least in Europe, also in the US, is that the loss of biodiversity are getting public concern. What we really need is to address that concern into practical action, political actions. And in order to do that, it is my view from the academy, from the ivory tower, that you really need to give prediction of what will actually happen, and hopefully, not hopefully, but hopefully some of these predictions will harm and make political actions. So let's say now, be more concrete. Bovim was saying that he has had a talk with the leader of the opposition party today, and he got some very interesting questions. Let's say that he or our prime minister or maybe the king would give him the plead. Which action to take to let us be the first generation to live the natural environment in a better state than we inherited? He could have then found some of us that do research in that. Could we have answered? No. Not that chance. Because the thing we could have told him, we know that species losses causes dramatic changes of ecosystem properties. We know that there is a species loss that is far beyond that we can expect as some sort of natural background rate. For instance, in Norway, we even don't know this background rate. But we know that something is happening. We can present graphs like this. We can present that species that are threatened increases dramatically, and it increases dramatically in particular in these days. We can see, and this is the slide previously, we can see that these losses are likely to have big influences and how we experiencing the biosphere. Everything that we expect seems to hold, except that there are some few points that are not fulfilled yet, but things are going in a way that we are expected. We know that these effects are caused by the 5 evils in some or another wrapping. Fragmentation, pollution, forward-hasting, climate change, alien. That I could have answered, Bovim. That I could have said. A lot of you could have said the same. But what is the most important thing? That is habitat fragmentation, in my view. And we know that habitat loss is generally considered as the most important of those threats. We know that. I think what we really then need, and a lot of meta-analyses like this have shown that if you do something with the landscape structure, we get 3 major problems of that. It's reduced area size, increased isolation, increased edge effect, affecting the loss of biodiversity. So I think, and what scientific progress is dependent on, is that you get a concerted action on some specific problems that catch attention in the scientific community. And what I urge here now is that if we are going to make progress, if we are going to make these big groundbreaking results and step ahead, we have to focus on the consequences of land losses and habitat degradation. So what I think we have to do is that we have to make space for nature. And if I could have answered Bovim, if I got this played, I have had to answer how should the area be structured in order to reduce area loss, species losses. That doesn't solve the problem. It doesn't solve the problem at all. But it is a way, it gives some practical goals, it gives us some practical road ahead. It gives some targeted goals. And we can relate it to some general ecological theory. There are so few general principles in ecology. It's a nightmare that is like that. And that, I don't say that it says something about ecologists, because they must be out there, but we haven't identified them yet. But one of those few that are there are this increase in number of species that increase at a logarithmic scale approximately linearly with area. So that is a fundamental relationship that can be used as an outset to understand how things is going to change if area losses occur. But the problem is that if you're going to say something about the future, we have to say something of how this will affect the dynamics. And we cannot do that because we simply don't know which factors really affecting the form of these relationships. So what does that mean? That means that I cannot answer Bovim. I cannot answer a forest owner saying how much area can I get timber from without reducing the biodiversity to a certain fraction. I cannot answer a farmer. I cannot answer a guy that wants to build a big road through an area. I cannot answer a property developer that wants to build houses. I cannot answer. That's a big challenge. So why can't I answer? So what does the whole problem boils down to? It, of course, boils down to some sort of... So that's... There's the key figure has disappeared. the key figure is that there is a non-linear increase in the number of species with area that we know. So if you cut at an area, destroy it, then the number of species doesn't decrease linearly. So the form of this species area curves, we really need to know the form of in order to give prediction about the consequences of the land use change. Then, when we have this, we can say that this will happen. Then we can ask other questions. We can then identify which landscape scale processes that drives these changes. We can then understand the societal drivers and the policy making that is necessary to change these changes in the habitat configuration and the landscape structure. Then we can predict how this will change if this happens under global change, because then we get the cocktail effect among different drivers. Then we can, of course, start to develop ecosystem metrics that will be most appropriate to track these changes. Then we can start to answer the plea. And we can do things like that. We can make space for nature. We can try different optimal design of the landscape structure. But in order to do this, there is a tremendous need for two things. We need to secure temporal data. We see, as you were saying earlier today, we get an accumulation of spatial data all over the world. The problem is that many of those time series that can really be used to say something about changes are disappearing because it's so difficult getting funding for those. And what we need to do is that we need to have a multidisciplinary experimental approaches to check the reliability of our prediction. That's a big, big challenge for ecology, that we do so little ecological experiments at a large enough scale. And one very likely research area to do this is Trøndelag. I think it should be a very nice goal to show that with appropriate actions, the reduction in biodiversity in this county can be stopped. So this can be a national research laboratory for stopping biodiversity changes by affecting the land use practices. And in order to address that kind of processes, this kind of questions, we did much larger research group that has a formalized collaboration, like a center. Thank you very much. Tack.
Sit that for you as well. There you go, thank you. So now we move over to the plenary session, and let's see how painless we can do this. So we're running a bit late, but so if the panelists can move up on stage while I'm talking, then I think we would save some time. Bob is already seated, that's good. So Ivar Basta will be leading this session, the plenary session. He's a man with many hats. He's here today as in his role as a senior advisor at the Norwegian Environment Agency. However, he's also a general manager of the Folgefond Center. He's an IPBES bureau member and a co-chair of the IPBES task force on capacity building. Ivar has been tasked with tying the seminar all together with the help of the panelists over the next minutes. And for some reason, we've moved into Mexican time and not Norwegian time, but I hope you can bear with us on that, except maybe for Donald, who will... Okay, yeah. So, but then it's when we have the technical issues ready, I'll just give the floor to Ivar, and if you have any questions to the panel as well, Ivar will let you know when you can raise your hand. Yep. Thank you, Ivar.
Wow, thanks a lot, Ingrid, and thanks for bearing with us that we're a bit over time. I think actually, to me, this has been a really interesting afternoon, looking at the fact that if we are to governing biodiversity sustainable, it's really highly knowledge intensive. We need knowledge about the very complex interaction between nature and society. So it seems to me that of course we need knowledge generation, we need very good policies, but we need this to shorten this feedback loop between science and policy. And we need to also make sure that we do have shared knowledge across the sort of multiple nodes around the world in a kind of polycentric society that is really not sort of fully governed, but it's kind of working in tandem. So shared knowledge, I think, is really a key issue. The other issue, I think, which we need to keep in mind is that, and we've heard a lot about that, is actually the confidence level of the knowledge we have at hand. Because that is something that actually can vary quite a lot, and there are ways of dealing with that. And I think all the different kinds of institutions that we've heard about today that are actually operating in this science policy interface are really key to the future of our planet, in my view. Now, I think that since we are running a bit late, I'd like to open up for questions from the audience pretty quickly, but just before I do that, I have to sort of make one disclosure, and that's the fact that over the years, Bob Watson has been sort of one of my key mentors in my work internationally in the science policy interface. So I've asked him very many stupid questions throughout some 25 years or so. So I'd like to sort of pose one sort of question that's been bothering me a bit, because like 25 years ago, Bob initiated and chaired the very first global assessment of the state of biodiversity in the world. I happened to sort of work with him on that. Of course, we put that forward. Clearly, it showed unprecedented loss of biodiversity. It showed all the different drivers, indirect and direct. It sort of laid out a whole suite of response options. Now, here we stand 25 years later. And, okay, what have we seen? Well, we've seen a 25% increase in population growth, population in the whole world, a 75% increase in total GDP. Trade has tripled. Where do we stand now? Well, we stand that when we look 25 years into the future, we'll probably see more of the same, more population growth, more economic growth, more trade. So, Bob, what have we learned these last 25 years that could embrace us to sort of meet the next 25 years as a species?
Yeah, I mean, clearly we've got a much better understanding of the climate system and the impact of humans on the climate system. We've got a better understanding of the impacts, and we've got a better understanding of how to adapt and how to mitigate. And in biodiversity, again, I think we have a much better understanding of, again, how the drivers, indirect and direct drivers, are affecting different ecosystems. We've made major progress in the sense that governments now acknowledge the problem, i.e. we have the Paris Agreement, and we acknowledge the challenges of biodiversity. We have the HE targets. So we've got governments speaking the right words, but we're absolutely missing the level of actions we need in both climate change and in addressing biodiversity. And I think it's the beginning of your talk. We haven't adequately looked at the vested interests. And I think it's absolutely crucial. I had a slide that said we have to understand the reality of the political system, socio-political. We have to understand the vested interests, the power symmetries in the world to have any chance of making progress. We have to get the public to be speaking much louder that they care about these issues and they want to see governments act, they want to see the private sector move to more sustainable practices. So we've got lots more information, but Everyone is still looking at short-term issues of jobs, the economy, and they're not looking in a more integrated fashion. So I agree, in 25 years' time, we'll have exactly the same debate as we are today, and it'll be worse. We've wasted the last 25 years in many respects. Ever since the Rio conference in 1992, where we talked about biodiversity and goals, we talked about climate change, and in reality, very little action.
Well, yeah, that's encouraging. And any questions on that note to the panel?
It's the reality of it.
Yes, please.
You talk about the confidence in the research, the understanding, and have you had any success in communicating that to policymakers? What the impact of the potential consequences are versus how much we actually are confident in that data?
Yeah, I mean, you should hear from the other panel members and Eva himself. I think the fact that we have the Paris Agreement and the fact we have the Aichi targets, I think we have convinced the governments that we actually have a reasonably good understanding of the implications of human actions, both on the Earth's climate system and the ramifications of how it affects human well-being, food, water, security, etc. And I think we've convinced them, again, we have a reasonably good understanding at the macro level of the implications on biodiversity, on ecosystems and their services. There are big gaps in our knowledge, but we generally know that what we're doing is adversely affecting biodiversity, adversely affecting climate, and most of the consequences on various elements of human well-being are negative in most parts of the world. I think if we had not convinced them of that, we wouldn't have the Paris Agreement, we wouldn't have the Aichi targets. The challenge now for the governments is, as I mentioned in my talk, they've got to work across government departments. You can't just look at the Department of Agriculture or Environment or Water or Transportation or Energy, and we have to have government working with civil society and the private sector to collectively come up with a solution space. So I think we've done, yes, there's uncertainties in all of our science, but we know enough to act better than what. So I'm always worried when we stress the uncertainty, we should talk about the uncertainties, never hide them, but we also are giving governments that, well, you'll have better knowledge in the future. We know enough today to do a much better job to address climate change and biodiversity loss. Much better job.
And John, on the cuddly animals, how does it fare there?
I think the cuddly animals are interesting because the cuddly animals actually show that when we care about doing something, we actually can do it.
Yes.
So that if you want to look at the animals who are going against the trends, those big, cuddly, charismatic ones are actually doing pretty good. Like, the rhinos aren't doing so well, right? And a few flagships are going badly. But many of them are actually coming back into places where we never thought we'd ever have them again. Like, even Denmark has wolves now, okay, right? Who would have thought that 30 years ago, okay? Amazing things happen. And they show that we can actually do things when we care enough. I think we have to learn from these kind of case studies about what does it actually take to try to upscale this, because it's easy when you focus on one species at a time, but we can't save biodiversity by focusing on one species at a time. So somehow we have to make people care about the abstract. Like, a moose is a moose, a wolf is a wolf, everyone can identify it. Biodiversity is just an abstraction. And somehow we have to get better at marketing that, because we have to upscale to wider conceptual things. But I think we have enough material to learn from these successes, and also to tell people that we can succeed. Because everyone is drowning in a doom and gloom, the planet's going to hell in the morning, but actually it's going both ways at the same time. And I think we can put out those kind of positive messages, learn from them, and try to adapt them and upscale them. So that's what I say the cuddly animals can contribute.
Excellent. Bernd Erik?
I think what we really have learned now is how things work much better during the past 25 years. But the big difference, what I feel, is that we now see much more public concern about what's really going on. And we see it in Central Europe. People are concerned about food production. You see that the last oak forest, they are really concerned about what's happening with them. And I'm not sure about this, but I'm thinking if you have, for instance, in UK, if you have counted the memberships of Royal Society for Protection of Birds, Bird Ornithology Union, and this, and compare it with the number of people that are part of a supporter club for a premiership team, I think that number is much larger. I don't know, but I can think about it. So I think this, and therefore I think it's so important to have these short-term positive goals, not that this is something negative going on all the time. It goes to hell. I think we have to give some sort more at a local scale. We want to save something in our neighborhood.
Excellent. A question up there?
Yeah, thank you. I just want to put a little bit provocative question, because I think that we have had so much focus on climate change for the past 20 years, so I feel a little bit that that has been on the cost of habitat loss. I would like to hear about what your opinions are about that. And then I also wonder a little bit if we biologists should be a little bit more concerned about population growth. We don't talk very much about that, and I think that is very much missing, because the more people, the more effect.
There's no question the world, both the scientific community, because that's where much of the funding has come, and the political community has focused much more on climate change than it has on the loss of biodiversity, big issues in the ocean, land degradation. And I think so the focus on climate in some respects has come at a cost of focusing on biodiversity. I don't think there's any question whatsoever about that. And I even sort of say a person that I used to work with very closely, Al Gore, who did a brilliant job as a politician of trying to get the message across to the public and to politicians that climate change was important. I just could not get him to talk about biodiversity and the interaction. So he was really comfortable talking about climate change, not comfortable talking about biodiversity. There was ministers also in the British government felt really comfortable on climate change, not comfortable. And so there is an issue there. Also, we've not done a good enough job, well, I think we're getting better, to show how biodiversity and ecosystems and their services truly underpin human well-being through food production, clean water. It's got social cohesion dimension. It's got security dimensions. And so we've got to more and more show how climate change and biodiversity themselves interact, and how collectively they interact with what the average person in the street truly cares about. You mentioned population. I mean, all of the big models, whether they're biodiversity models or whether they're climate models, do bring in the indirect drivers, of which one of the 5 big indirect drivers is demographic change. Total number of people, do they live in urban regions, rural, family size, etc., etc. Where there's been a nervousness and sometimes inappropriate discussion is some people say the whole problem is population growth, and then it makes it sound like it's the fault of developing countries. No, the fault is consumption patterns of all of us. The consumption pattern of an average American versus an average Indian is 10 to 1 on energy, not on food, but it's probably 5 to 1 on food. So what we have to talk about is what drives demand for resources, and it is obviously the combination, as Eva actually said, of population and obviously of ability to purchase. And so yes, we should focus on population, but in the context of the ability to purchase, and therefore we have to recognize the equity ethical issues of what should an average person be able to consume. And so yes, China's emissions have now exceeded significantly the US. On a per capita basis, they're still only a quarter. The per capita emissions in India are 1/10 to 1/20 of an American. So I think population's an important issue. There is no question the less people we have on the planet, the more chance of being sustainable. But we also have to look at how we produce goods, how we consume goods, etc. So it should be part of the dialogue, but I think we have to do it carefully and constructively without it sounding like we're just blaming now developing countries whose population is growing faster than developed countries.
John?
Yeah.
No, I think the question on climate versus kind of biodiversity is quite interesting because, and here I'm just kind of speculating, okay? But climate is a great political fudge because it's such a large-scale thing that you can grandstand about it, you can talk about it, you can pledge to it, but it's so big and diffuse and over there, and you can point your finger to the rainforest or to a coal plant somewhere else, that you can just really kind of fudge it, okay? But biodiversity is here and now. So if you're going to do something about your biodiversity, you've got to tell your farmers, your foresters, your people to stop doing something or change something. And that is very close to that is your voters. It's not these abstractions in Brazil or Poland or somewhere else. It's people at home. And that's where politicians really feel uncomfortable because it actually has a consequence. And I think they simply lack the will and strength to actually stand up to their own voters and actually make unpopular decisions. So that's a speculation here, okay, right? But I do agree that climate and these big abstractions have taken the focus away from biodiversity. Environment has become chemistry, right? And the species have fallen out a long time ago. And I think the public also fall off because the public care about species. They like little birds and cuddly animals and butterflies. They don't care about kind of molecules. That is the power paradox, right? Because I think the policies that we're seeing politicians affect are not in accordance with what their publics actually want. And this is back to the whole question of who actually has the power. Because I think the publics actually care. They are motivated and they care. Okay, maybe they don't always want to make the changes when it comes to them, but they do care. But the policies are somehow mismatching with what the public want. And this is where the whole thing comes down to special interests. Who is benefiting from unsustainable practices? That's the real question, I think.
In some way, I think you are correct, but there's another dimension here, is that I think the politicians has been too much afraid for the negative aspects of biodiversity. I think that whether there is knowledge or scareness of really focusing on the positive aspects of the biodiversity, but I think there are at least in some areas are really changing these days, because I think much more people now see biodiversity as an asset than they did previously.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, actually. I don't know how many more questions we are, but we are actually sort of about to round up this discussion. Yeah, one more.
Can I ask?
Why not? Yeah.
I guess what I have to say is maybe less than popular, but it's growing in popularity in my country, which is the United States. Less than functional right now. But I feel like there's a lot of young people here, and maybe they're not really interested in this, but I feel like, how important do you think it is that students who are maybe doing their master's in a scientific discipline decide to go into politics?
How important is it?
For students to go
How important is it for students that are doing masters
and actually
that has a science background?
To bridge the gap, as you guys are saying.
Very. Is a really simple answer, very. The problem is, if I look at sort of two governments I know relatively well and have worked for two, the United Kingdom and the USA, if you look at the total number of senators and congressmen and women that have any true clue beyond high school on science, I think it's 5 have got scientific degrees, 1 I think has got a PhD. If I look in the United Kingdom, I'm not sure that even a single member of parliament now has a PhD. A few have got undergraduate degrees in science, but not many. The way the UK government has got round the problem is actually, and people might not like it, but in the House of Lords, they've actually given temporary positions in the House of Lords to a number of world-leading British scientists to make sure when they put policy together, there is a scientific input. So many policies first go to the House of Lords if it's got anything that's got health implications or sort of scientific implications. But no, I believe, and the biggest difference I see is between China, which many of the politicians are technocrats, world-leading technocrats. And so they actually see science and technology as a solution for the future. They probably don't appreciate the social aspects as much as they should. But in US and in UK, it's devoid of really any thinking other than the support staff. So I would absolutely stress that as someone interested in science and environment, in the issues we've talked about today, going into politics, absolutely I would encourage. There's no question. Going into politics in the US at the moment with the idiot we've got as a president, I think is a different issue. And or in Brexit in England, probably shouldn't get started on either of those issues. They're both disastrous.
Especially while the video is streaming.
Listen, they're both disastrous.
Well, I thought we were kind of moving on to a more positive note towards the end. But I think actually we are, because I think what we see is actually a lot of politicians, a lot of people in society also recognize that the more people we become on the planet, the bigger footprint we have, the more need there is to move towards a green transition. And in a green transition, biodiversity obviously is an asset. So I think there are some big opportunities out there. And I think some of the analysis that have been done, for instance, of the ACHI targets of the indicators show that we do actually have significant progress in terms of action. It's just that it's not fully enough to sort of stem the tide in a way. But we are actually as a society doing better, and we should pride ourselves, I think, on that. And I think there also have been some important meta-studies published in high-level journals also showing the same thing. Then we have the sort of big challenge, which is kind of how to make the different sectors of society work better together. That's always sort of described as a sort of the big obstacle, but it's also a huge opportunity, because if you manage to get all these different components of society and all the different skills and professions and craftsmanships that are out there to work together, it's almost unbeatable. So I think we should try to round off on a positive note and thank the speakers for a very interesting afternoon session. And thanks to the organizers for pulling this all together. And thank you, the audience, for bearing with us and staying with us all the way through. So have a nice evening.
I think you're right.